The heavy timber doors of the barn slammed open against the brutal force of the mountain wind. A freezing howl of white snow swept into the dark interior, carrying the bitter promise of a deadly winter. Emmeline tightened her massive calloused hands around the rough wooden shaft of a rusted pitchfork. Her tremendous muscles bunched and locked, trembling from the raw, blinding terror of a mother who had finally run out of places to hide. Behind her massive frame, buried deep within a pile of sweet-smelling alfalfa hay, a small, terrified whimper broke the tense silence. Little Clara was freezing, and they were entirely trapped. What happens when an unstoppable force of a mother meets an immovable mountain of a man? The folk in the valley towns like to spin wild yarns about the beastly giant of a woman who invaded a lonely rancher in his quiet life. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay until the end of this memory to hear how this extraordinary tale truly unfolded, and be sure to leave a remark telling me where you are listening from to see how far the wind carries this story tonight. Kerosene lanterns swung into their doorway, casting a warm, golden circle of light against the oppressive darkness. Heavy, deliberate boot steps crunched against the wooden floorboards. A man stepped into the barn. He was a towering frontierman, built with immense thick shoulders and a heavy frame shaped by decades of breaking wild horses and felling timber. He wore a weathered canvas work shirt and a heavy leather vest that stretched tight across his broad chest. His unkempt, shoulder-length hair and thick beard were dusted with fresh snow. He stood in the entrance like a solitary mountain peak, blocking their only avenue of escape. Emmeline stepped forward, placing her towering, heavily muscular body entirely between the intruder and her daughter. She stood at her full height, rising taller than most men who had ever dared to cross her path. Her physique was powerfully built, forged by years of grueling, relentless labor that had layered heavy, thick muscle across her broad shoulders, her powerful biceps, and her massive thighs. She wore a simple, form-fitting gray dress that was torn at the shoulders, exposing the sheer physical power of her arms. She was covered in the wild dust of the trail, her light brown hair falling in chaotic, messy waves around her resolute face. She looked like a wild, cornered beast ready to kill to protect her young. "Do not take another step." Her voice came out harsh, raspy, and thick with absolute desperation. She leveled the rusted steel tines of the pitchfork directly at his chest. The giant cowboy stopped. He did not draw a weapon. He did not shout for the local sheriff. He merely held the lantern higher, allowing the golden light to wash over her towering figure. His weathered, sun-bronzed face remained completely stoic. His sharp, observant eyes took in the threatening weapon, the immense span of her shoulders, and the raw panic burning in her eyes. There was no disgust in his expression. There was no mockery. There was only a quiet, heavy stillness. Emmeline braced her thick legs, expecting the inevitable violence. For weeks, they had been hunted across the freezing plains. They had been starved, chased, and treated like monsters. Her overwhelming physical strength had been the only thing keeping them alive, allowing her to break locks, carry her exhausted child for miles through deep snow, and fend off the cruel men who saw her only as a massive beast of burden. She was prepared to fight this massive rancher to the death. She gathered every ounce of her tremendous strength, ready to drive the steel tines forward if he made a single aggressive move. Instead, the towering man moved with a deliberate, calculated slowness. He slowly lowered his arm and gently placed the kerosene lantern upon an overturned wooden barrel. The warm light stabilized, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the barn. He raised both of his large, calloused hands into the air, showing her that his palms were empty. "You are shivering," his voice rumbled through the quiet barn. It was a deep, quiet sound, carrying the steady, grounding calm of a man who had spent his entire life speaking softly to frightened wild animals. The absolute lack of malice in his deep voice confused her deeply. Emmeline refused to lower the pitchfork. Every sculpted muscle in her heavy arms remained locked and rigid. In the harsh, unforgiving lawlessness of the western frontier, men simply did not offer mercy to giant, ragged women caught trespassing on private land. They offered a cage, or they offered a bullet. She breathed heavily, her broad chest heaving as she watched his every twitch. From the pile of hay behind her heavy leather boots, a tiny hand reached out. Little Clara grabbed the muddy hem of the gray dress. The little girl peered around the massive protective wall of her mother, her small face pale and drawn tight from days without a proper meal. The stoic rancher froze. His sharp eyes dropped from the threatening steel of the pitchfork and locked instantly onto the fragile, starving child hiding in the hay. A sudden, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his heavy posture. For a fraction of a second, the hardened, solitary presence of the mountain man seemed to fracture. A profound, deeply buried sorrow flashed across his weathered features, an echo of a pain so intense it seemed to steal the very breath from his massive lungs. He stared at the little girl for a long, silent moment. The howling wind battered the roof, but inside the air had grown thick with an unspoken, heavy emotional weight. "The storm is getting worse out there." He spoke very softly, keeping his eyes entirely focused on the child before slowly returning his calm gaze to the towering mother. "There is fresh water in the iron trough by the door. Do not touch the gray stallion in the last stall." "He kicks." Without waiting for a response, the solitary cowboy turned around. He turned his broad, completely unprotected back toward a desperate, wildly muscular intruder who was still aiming a deadly weapon directly at him. It was an act of profound, staggering trust that completely shattered the defensive walls surrounding the heavy heart of Emmeline. He walked slowly out into the biting cold, pulling the heavy timber doors firmly shut behind him. He sealed out the deadly winter wind, leaving them perfectly safe in the warm, golden glow of the lantern he had purposefully left behind. Emmeline stood paralyzed in the quiet warmth. She slowly lowered the heavy pitchfork, her chunky leather boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt floor. She stared at the closed doors, a sudden storm of intense curiosity completely overwhelming her primal fear. Why did he not drive them out into the blizzard? What kind of man simply walked away from a trespasser? She turned to comfort her starving daughter, kneeling down to wrap her massive muscular arms around the fragile child. But as she knelt in the hay, her eyes caught sight of the object the stoic rancher had deliberately placed next to the lantern on the wooden barrel. A small, carefully folded woolen blanket rested there, and resting gently on top of the folded wool was something that made the breath catch violently in her throat. A terrifying revelation proving this isolated mountain man already knew exactly who was hunting them. Resting gently on top of the folded wool was a crumpled, heavy piece of parchment. Emmeline slowly reached out with a trembling, calloused hand. Her thick fingers unfolded the paper, revealing a terrifying truth. It was a bounty notice. A harsh, cruel ink drawing depicted a towering woman with wild hair and monstrous physical proportions. Bold black letters promised a handsome reward of silver for the immediate return of an escaped laborer. The paper accused her of dangerous violence. The paper demanded she be returned in heavy iron chains. The solitary rancher already knew exactly who was hiding in the hay. He knew the terrifying reputation assigned to her by cruel, greedy men. He knew that harboring a runaway of her immense size would bring ruthless hunters directly to his quiet valley. You must understand the brutal reality of the western frontier. In these remote mountains, a piece of paper offering a bounty is a death warrant. Men would eagerly spill innocent blood for a fraction of that silver. Yet this towering, stoic mountain man had stared directly at the wanted woman, observed the rusted pitchfork aimed at his chest, and chosen to lower his lantern. He had chosen to provide warmth instead of a cage. Emmeline stared at the closed wooden doors. The roaring blizzard battered the roof, but inside, a strange, breathless quiet settled over her. She crumpled the cruel notice in her massive fist, burying the lie deep within the pocket of her ragged gray dress. She turned back to the trembling child. With profound care, the heavily muscular mother lifted the folded woolen blanket. She wrapped it snugly around the small shoulders of little Clara. The child buried her face into the soft fabric, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. Emmeline sat back against the wooden wall of the stall. Her towering, powerful physique finally stopped trembling. The crushing primal fear that had dictated every waking moment for the past 3 months slowly began to loosen its lethal grip. For an hour, the only sounds were the howling wind and the rhythmic breathing of the horses. Then the heavy iron latch clanked loudly. The massive wooden doors opened just enough to admit the towering rancher. A blast of freezing white snow swirled around his thick leather boots before he shoved the doors shut against the tempest. He carried a wide, covered wooden tray. The rich, savory aroma of roasted venison and freshly baked bread instantly permeated the cold air of the barn. It was a smell that caused the stomach of the giant mother to twist in agonizing knots. She tightened her grip on the sleeping child, unsure of what the silent cowboy expected in return for such a feast. He did not approach the shadows. He did not issue a single command. The weathered man simply walked toward an overturned wooden barrel near the center of the room. He set the heavy tray down with utmost care. Next to the tray, he placed a large tin cup filled to the brim with warm, fresh milk. He did not look toward the hay. Instead, he turned his broad, powerful back to them. He retrieved a stiff brush from a hook on the wall and stepped into the nearest stall to groom a restless, roan stallion. He was offering them the rarest, most precious gift a hunted soul could ever receive. He was offering them absolute privacy. He was granting them profound dignity. Emmeline moved with shocking, silent grace for a woman of such staggering weight. Her chunky leather boots made absolutely no sound against the loose dirt. She approached the barrel, gathered the heavy tray in her thickly muscled arms, and retreated back to the safety of the dark corner. She woke the child with a gentle nudge. The eyes of the little girl widened at the sight of the hot food. Emmeline tore the warm bread with her heavy, capable hands. She fed the fragile child first, ensuring every bite was thoroughly chewed. She held the tin cup to the lips of the girl, watching the warm milk bring a flush of life back to those pale, hollow cheeks. Only when the child was completely full did the giant mother allow herself to eat. The hot food hit her empty stomach like a burst of pure sunlight. The warmth rushed through her massive chest, traveling down her powerfully built thighs and spreading out to her frozen fingertips. As she consumed the nourishing meal, she kept her sharp eyes locked on the broad shoulders of the silent protector. The stoic cowboy moved with a heavy, steady rhythm. The thick muscles beneath his weathered canvas shirt flexed and released with every stroke of the brush. He was a man deeply acquainted with grueling, back-breaking labor. Yet there was a profound gentleness in the way he spoke softly to the nervous stallion. A cautious, fragile relief finally blossomed within the scarred heart of the wild survivor. Perhaps, for just one night, they were truly safe. When the wooden tray was entirely scraped clean, the tall rancher stepped out of the stall. He returned the stiff brush to the iron hook. Without glancing toward the dark corner, he walked over and collected the empty dishes. He reached for the heavy iron latch of the main door, preparing to return to his isolated cabin for the night. He pulled the timber door open. A violent, shrieking gust of wind tore through the yard, ripping the door entirely from his grasp. A loud, terrifying crack of splintering wood echoed above the roar of the blizzard. The heavy, reinforced wooden support beam of the external cattle shelter had snapped under the lethal weight of the mounting snow. The massive timber structure was leaning precariously, threatening to completely collapse and crush the helpless herd trapped beneath the freezing roof. The rancher dropped the tray and rushed out into the brutal storm. He drove his thick, powerful shoulders directly underneath the collapsing timber, his heavy boots sliding backward in the deep, freezing mud. He pushed upward with all of his formidable might, a guttural groan tearing from his throat. The muscles of his broad back bulged under the leather vest. However, the freezing, waterlogged wood was simply too massive. The crushing weight was entirely too heavy for one mortal man to lift alone. He gritted his teeth, his large frame trembling violently as the roof continued to sink inch by terrible inch. From the dark safety of the barn, Emmeline watched the silent protector failing against the relentless winter storm. The heavy, thick muscles of her own massive arms twitched with raw instinct. If the rancher fell, the animals would perish and his entire livelihood would be utterly destroyed. However, stepping out into the harsh light of the storm meant revealing the full, terrifying extent of her monstrous giant strength. Would she remain hidden in the shadows to protect her fragile daughter, or would she risk total exposure to save the stoic stranger who had just saved their lives? The giant mother did not hesitate for another heartbeat. Emmeline surged forward, her thick, powerful legs driving her out of the warm sanctuary and directly into the freezing, violent chaos of the blizzard. The icy wind immediately lashed at her exposed skin, whipping her messy, light brown hair across her resolute face. She ignored the bitter cold. She ignored the primal fear of exposure. She closed the distance to the struggling rancher in 3 massive, ground-eating strides. Callahan gritted his teeth, his broad shoulders screaming under the lethal weight of the splintering timber roof. His heavy leather boots slid backward another painful inch in the freezing mud. He was failing. The massive wooden structure groaned loudly, preparing to completely crush both the solitary man and the trapped herd beneath it. Suddenly, a towering figure stepped completely into his peripheral vision. Emmeline wedged her massive, heavily muscular frame directly underneath the thick wooden beam beside him. She planted her chunky leather boots deep into the freezing mud, establishing a wide, unbreakable base. She raised her thick, powerful arms, pressing her broad palms flat against the wet, freezing wood. Every heavily developed muscle across her broad shoulders, her massive back, and her powerful biceps locked tight. She unleashed a fierce, guttural roar of absolute physical exertion. Emmeline drove upward. The heavy timber stopped sinking. The massive roof shuddered violently against the stormy sky. The thick, sculpted muscles of her immense thighs bulged visibly beneath the soaked, clinging fabric of her torn gray dress. She pushed with staggering, overwhelming force, taking the vast majority of the lethal burden entirely onto her own broad shoulders. The heavy wooden structure slowly, agonizingly rose back into the freezing air. Callahan turned his head, his sharp eyes widening in absolute shock. He stared at the towering woman beside him, completely stunned by the sheer, devastating physical power she possessed. She was effortlessly holding a massive weight that would have shattered the spine of an ordinary frontier man. "Push the support post," Emmeline commanded, her thick voice straining heavily under the immense pressure. The stoic rancher snapped out of his stunned disbelief. He lunged forward, kicking the thick wooden support post back into a firm, vertical position beneath the heavy beam. Emmeline carefully lowered the immense weight of the roof until it settled safely onto the sturdy post. The structure groaned under the storm, but it held firm. The frightened cattle beneath them stamped their hooves, perfectly safe from the deadly elements. They stood together in the howling blizzard, both of them breathing in deep, ragged gasps. Callahan looked at the towering, wildly muscular woman standing in the deep snow. She did not look like a monster. She looked like a powerful guardian carved from solid mountain granite. He gave a single, slow nod of profound respect. By dawn, the howling winds had temporarily reduced to a bitter, whispering chill. A stark, pale light filtered across the frozen valley. Emmeline emerged from the barn before the sun fully breached the horizon. She refused to be a burden. She refused to accept his quiet charity without proving the absolute worth of her massive hands. She left little Clara sleeping warmly beneath the woolen blanket and stepped out into the freezing yard. Callahan walked out of his cabin carrying a heavy iron wood-splitting maul, intending to restock the firewood for the coming freeze. He stopped completely in his tracks. The towering mother was already at the woodpile. She did not bother using an axe. Emmeline gripped massive, heavy logs of frozen pine with her thick, calloused hands. She lifted the heavy timber with shocking ease, utilizing the immense power of her heavy thighs and broad back. She hoisted the logs onto the wooden cutting block and brought a heavy iron sledgehammer down with devastating, explosive force. The thick wood split cleanly in half with a resounding crack that echoed across the silent valley. She repeated the brutal labor with a relentless mechanical rhythm. The torn, sleeveless elements of her rugged gray dress completely exposed the heavy, shifting muscles of her massive shoulders and powerful biceps. Sweat gathered on her resolute brow, her body completely ignoring the bitter cold of the morning. She was a woman intimately acquainted with absolute hardship, proving that her immense size was not a curse, but rather a profoundly valuable asset. The solitary rancher watched her from the wooden porch. His weathered, sun-bronzed face remained absolutely stoic, but a deep, quiet shift occurred within his guarded chest. He recognized the desperate, fierce pride driving her relentless labor. He knew the profound difference between a laborer breaking their back for pennies and a desperate mother fighting to earn the very air her child breathed. He walked across the snowy yard, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly against the frozen earth. He did not order her to stop. He did not insult her dignity by demanding she return to the warmth of the barn. Instead, Callahan silently picked up an armful of the freshly split wood. He carried the heavy load toward the cabin. He returned a few moments later, picked up another massive log, and carefully placed it upon the iron cutting block for her. He stepped back, offering her the silent space to continue her work. They worked together for several hours in a profound, heavy silence. They established a quiet, rhythmic dance of grueling frontier labor. When the mountain of wood was fully stacked against the cabin wall, Emmeline moved immediately to the barn. She easily hauled dense bales of heavy hay over her broad shoulders, moving weights that typically required two strong men to manage. She fed the restless livestock while Callahan meticulously mended the broken iron latches of the stalls. A simple gratitude slowly evolved into a deep, unspoken mutual respect. For the first time in his isolated, solitary life, the stoic mountain man had found a soul who could stand firmly shoulder to shoulder with him in the punishing, brutal world he inhabited. The heavy burden of his lonely existence felt for one morning slightly less crushing. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Emmeline stopped beside the wooden fence. She wiped the sweat from her dirty brow with the back of her thick arm. She felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest. It was the profoundly rare feeling of simply being useful, of being accepted without a single word of cruel judgment. But the fragile peace of the valley was merely an illusion. The temperature plummeted violently. The pale sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A secondary, much harsher winter storm began rolling over the jagged mountain peaks, bringing a massive wall of blinding white snow that promised to completely trap them on the isolated ranch for weeks. Callahan stood beside her, his sharp eyes narrowed as he studied the approaching whiteout conditions. The silence between them shattered when the distant, unmistakable sound of a heavy brass bell echoed through the howling wind. Emmeline stepped forward, her heavy muscles instantly tensing as she stared into the blinding wall of approaching snow. Through the raging blizzard, the dark, menacing silhouettes of a massive stagecoach and 4 exhausted horses slowly emerged, driving straight toward the sanctuary of the ranch. But it was not the unexpected stagecoach that made the blood run completely cold in her veins. It was the heavily armed men riding directly behind it. Who was braving a deadly blizzard to reach a solitary mountain ranch? The dark, menacing silhouettes finally broke through the blinding wall of white snow. Emmeline tightened her massive fists, her powerful back muscles locking as she prepared to defend the quiet ranch. However, the heavily armed riders were not the ruthless bounty hunters she feared. They were merely local deputies, half frozen and completely exhausted, escorting a stranded stagecoach. The passengers inside were a wealthy town merchant and his family, caught completely unaware by the brutal, sudden ferocity of the mountain blizzard. The frontier code of survival demanded mercy, and Callahan silently opened his heavy timber doors to the desperate travelers. For 2 complete days, the relentless storm battered the isolated cabin. The unexpected guests survived the freezing temperatures, but their presence came at a heavy cost. They consumed a massive portion of the carefully preserved winter stores. When the howling wind finally died and the sky cleared into a brilliant, piercing blue, the reality of their situation became starkly apparent. The solitary rancher needed to travel into the mountain settlement to replenish his empty larder, or they would all starve before the spring thaw. Emmeline refused to stay behind. She possessed a towering, fiercely independent spirit. She owed this stoic mountain man a profound debt for shielding her daughter, and she fully intended to repay it with the raw, devastating power of her heavy hands. Leaving little Clara tucked warmly beneath the thick woolen blankets in the bed of the heavy draft wagon, Emmeline climbed onto the wooden bench beside Callahan. The journey into the bustling settlement of Oak Creek was brutal. The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon churned through deep, freezing slush and thick frontier mud. As they approached the edge of the town, the familiar, suffocating dread began to creep back into the broad chest of the giant mother. In the lonely isolation of the mountains, her immense size was a tool for survival. In the judgmental eyes of civilized society, her heavily muscular physique was a grotesque anomaly. Callahan pulled the massive draft horses to a halt in front of the local mercantile exchange. He secured the heavy leather reins, his weathered face remaining completely stoic. He stepped down and walked toward the assayer office across the muddy street, leaving Emmeline to manage the loading of the heavy supplies. Emmeline stepped down from the wagon. Her chunky leather boots sank deep into the freezing mud. The torn, sleeveless elements of her rugged gray dress completely exposed the heavy, shifting muscles of her massive shoulders and the thick, powerful circumference of her biceps. She stood at her full, towering height, dwarfing the average men walking along the wooden boardwalks. The reaction of the town was immediate and utterly merciless. Conversations abruptly ceased. The bustling noise of the street died away, replaced by harsh, judgmental whispers that cut through the freezing air like serrated blades. A well-dressed woman wearing a velvet coat gasped aloud, violently pulling her young children away from the edge of the street, as if Emmeline carried a deadly plague. Men standing outside the local saloon stopped their idle chatter, their eyes widening at the staggering width of her powerful back and the heavy tree trunk thickness of her muscular thighs. A group of idle, boisterous ranch hands gathered near the loading dock of the general store. They were men who built their fragile pride upon cruel mockery. "Look at the sheer size of that creature." A man with a missing front tooth sneered loudly, pointing a dirty finger directly at her towering frame. "Is that a woman or a shaved grizzly bear wearing a dress?" Another man barked a harsh, cruel laugh, elbowing his companion in the ribs. "I will wager $10 she could snap a wild stallion in half, but she could not find a man willing to marry her if she held a shotgun to his head." The cruel laughter erupted from the group, echoing loudly down the muddy street. The harsh sound hit Emmeline with the devastating force of a physical blow. A deep, burning humiliation flushed across her resolute face. She remembered every cruel overseer, every terrified glance, and every time she had been treated as a monstrous beast of burden rather than a human being. The overwhelming urge to shrink away, to hide her massive body in the dark shadows of the wagon, pulled heavily at her scarred heart. But then she heard the soft rustle of the woolen blankets behind her. Little Clara was watching. The deep humiliation inside the giant mother instantly transformed into a cold, unbreakable defiance. She would absolutely not allow her fragile daughter to see her cower before the cruelty of small-minded men. Emmeline straightened her massive spine. She hardened her jaw, her strong feminine features setting into a mask of pure mountain granite. She ignored the vicious mockery and marched directly toward the loading dock. She did not wait for the mercantile clerks to assist her. Emmeline reached down and grasped a massive 300-pound wooden barrel of salted pork. The idle men watched, expecting her to fail. Instead, she locked the thick, heavy muscles of her powerful thighs and heaved upward. The massive barrel lifted from the wooden dock with shocking, effortless grace. The heavy muscles of her immense biceps bulged with devastating power as she carried the crushing weight across the muddy street and gently lowered it into the back of the wagon. The cruel laughter abruptly stopped, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. However, the wounded pride of the idle men could not allow a woman to publicly demonstrate such overwhelming physical dominance. As Emmeline returned to the loading dock for a heavy crate of iron horseshoes, the men deliberately stepped forward. They formed a tight, menacing wall of bodies, completely blocking her path to the supplies. They intended to turn her quiet dignity into a humiliating public spectacle, boxing the giant woman into a corner for their own cruel amusement. Emmeline stopped. She clenched her massive fists, her broad chest heaving with rising tension. She was completely surrounded by hostile, mocking faces. Across the muddy street, the heavy wooden door of the assayer office opened. Callahan stepped out onto the raised boardwalk. His sharp, observant eyes instantly locked onto the crowd of men surrounding the towering woman. The heavy, stoic presence of the mountain man suddenly radiated a cold, lethal danger. Would the silent rancher turn his broad back and protect his own quiet reputation? Or would he step off the wooden porch and finally claim his place beside the giant woman the entire town despised? Callahan did not hesitate. He did not turn his broad back to protect his own quiet reputation. The heavy leather boots of the silent rancher stepped off the raised wooden boardwalk and descended directly into the freezing mud of the street. His strides were long, measured, and entirely unhurried, but they carried the devastating, undeniable weight of an approaching avalanche. The bustling town of Oak Creek seemed to hold its collective breath. The group of idle men surrounding the loading dock turned their hostile faces toward the advancing mountain man. The missing-tooth instigator puffed out his narrow chest, attempting to maintain his cruel bravado, but the sudden suffocating pressure radiating from Callahan made the man instinctively take a half-step backward. Callahan did not step in front of Emmeline. He did not attempt to hide her towering, heavily muscular frame behind his own massive physique. Instead, he stopped directly beside her, his broad shoulder brushing lightly against her thick, powerful arm. He claimed his place at her side, presenting a united, impenetrable wall of staggering physical strength to the small-minded men who sought to humiliate her. The silent message was absolutely clear to every soul watching. She was no longer a solitary hunted creature desperately running from her past. She was standing with him, and she was under his absolute protection. The instigator nervously shifted his weight in the freezing mud, attempting to laugh off the suffocating tension. "We are only having a bit of harmless fun, Callahan. You do not need to defend this wild beast. Look at the sheer size of her heavy arms. She is barely human." The weathered, sun-bronzed face of the stoic cowboy remained perfectly still, yet the winter air around them seemed to instantly freeze solid. Callahan slowly reached out. He placed his large, calloused hand flat against the heavy wooden crate of iron horseshoes resting on the loading dock. "You have exactly 3 seconds to step away from my wagon." The deep, rumbling voice of the rancher was barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the quiet street with lethal, terrifying clarity. "If you ever speak of this woman with such utter disrespect again, I will personally teach you the true meaning of hardship, and I will absolutely not be gentle about it." The cruel amusement entirely vanished from the faces of the ranch hands. They looked at the heavy, thick muscles bulging beneath the weathered canvas shirt of the stoic cowboy. And then they looked at the devastating, towering power of the giant mother standing right beside him. The men wisely chose immediate survival over their fragile pride. They scattered like frightened shadows, scurrying rapidly back toward the dim safety of the local saloon without uttering another defiant word. Emmeline stood perfectly still. Her broad chest heaved heavily as she processed what had just occurred. For years, she had relied solely upon her own overwhelming physical dominance to protect herself and her fragile child. She was intimately accustomed to fighting the entire world completely alone. Yet, in the face of brutal public mockery, this solitary mountain man had not shied away from her immense size. He had proudly stood beside her, fiercely validating her quiet dignity before the entire town. A profound, shattering warmth rushed through her heavy veins. The cold, unbreakable defiance that had shielded her scarred heart for so long began to slowly melt away, completely replaced by the beautiful, terrifying bloom of genuine trust. For the first time in a decade, the giant woman realized she did not have to carry the crushing weight of the world solely upon her own massive shoulders. Without exchanging a single spoken word, they turned back to the loading dock. A quiet, rhythmic choreography of immense frontier strength began. Emmeline easily hoisted heavy sacks of white flour and massive wooden crates of winter vegetables, her thick biceps flexing with absolute grace. Callahan carried heavy iron tools and large barrels of pure kerosene. They worked together in perfect, balanced harmony. The observing townspeople watched in absolute silence, completely awed by the sheer capability of the two towering figures. The harsh mockery had entirely died, thoroughly replaced by a fearful, grudging respect. When the heavy draft wagon was completely loaded, Callahan climbed onto the wooden bench. Emmeline pulled herself up beside him, her chunky leather boots resting firmly against the wooden floorboards. The stoic rancher snapped the heavy leather reins, and the massive draft horses pulled them away from the mercantile exchange, leaving the harsh judgment of civilized society far behind them in the mud. The journey back toward the isolated mountain valley was deeply peaceful. The bitter winds of the morning had completely vanished, leaving behind a crisp, silent world entirely blanketed in pure white snow. The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon hummed softly against the frozen earth. Emmeline sat close to the silent protector, allowing the comforting, heavy warmth of his broad shoulder to physically ground her. She felt entirely safe. It was the profound, beautiful, emotional safety she had never known in her entire life. Behind them, the thick woolen blankets in the bed of the wagon shifted gently. Little Clara poked her head out into the crisp mountain air. The pale, fragile cheeks of the child now carried a healthy touch of pink from the warm food and the deep, restful sleep. She quietly watched the towering back of the silent rancher, who was expertly guiding the heavy horses through the snow-covered mountain pass. Callahan remained completely focused on the road ahead. His weathered hands held the heavy leather lines with practiced, gentle ease. He was a man who demanded absolute silence from the brutal world around him, projecting an aura of completely unbreakable stoicism that kept every soul at a safe distance. But children possess a profound, unclouded vision of the heart. They do not see the heavy iron armor that men wear to protect their broken souls. They only see the raw, bleeding truth hiding beneath the quiet surface. Clara crawled forward, her tiny hands gripping the wooden backrest of the front bench. She looked up at the towering, silent cowboy. The little girl tilted her head, carefully studying the deep, permanent sorrow etched into the corners of his sharp, observant eyes. "Mr. Callahan?" The tiny, innocent voice of the little girl broke the heavy silence of the mountain pass. The rancher slightly turned his massive head, acknowledging the child without speaking a word. The little girl looked at the vast, snowy expanse of the empty valley stretching out before them. "Mr. Callahan, did your little girl know how to hide from the monsters too?" The reaction was immediate and utterly devastating. The heavy leather reins slipped completely from the calloused hands of the stoic mountain man. His broad shoulders violently flinched, jerking as if a rifle bullet had just torn straight through his massive chest. The completely unbreakable facade of the solitary cowboy shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right before their eyes. The heavy wooden wheels of the draft wagon ground to a complete, shuddering halt in the center of the snowy mountain pass. The sudden stop was not commanded by the heavy leather reins, but rather by the sheer, crushing weight of an old, devastating sorrow. The towering mountain man sat perfectly frozen on the wooden bench. His broad shoulders, which only an hour ago had formed an impenetrable shield against the mockery of the entire town, now slumped forward under an invisible, unbearable agony. His large, calloused hands rested entirely empty upon his thick denim trousers. Emmeline watched the massive chest of the silent protector hitch with a silent, ragged breath. He did not cry out. He did not shed a single visible tear. He simply stared into the blinding white expanse of the mountain valley, looking utterly, profoundly lost. The towering mother understood that kind of silence. It was the absolute hollow quiet of a soul that had survived the end of its own world. She did not offer empty, meaningless words of comfort. Emmeline simply shifted her heavy, muscular frame across the wooden bench. She reached out with her thick, capable hands and gently took the dropped leather reins. She clicked her tongue, urging the massive draft horses forward through the deep snow. Callahan did not protest. He remained perfectly still, a hollow mountain of a man surrendering the burden of leadership to the only person strong enough to carry it. The remainder of the journey back to the isolated ranch was cloaked in a heavy, reverent silence. The crisp winter air bit at their exposed skin, but the cold was nothing compared to the freezing sorrow radiating from the stoic cowboy. When they finally reached the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, the sun had fully dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the snowy yard. They worked together to unload the heavy supplies, moving with a quiet, rhythmic grace. Emmeline carried massive wooden crates of winter root vegetables and heavy sacks of flour with her immense strength, allowing the grueling physical labor to ground them both. Callahan silently chopped additional firewood, his thick muscles working mechanically in the fading twilight. Later that evening, the heavy iron stove radiated a deep, comforting warmth throughout the small log cabin. Little Clara slept soundly in a massive wooden rocking chair near the hearth, heavily bundled beneath the thick woolen blankets. Emmeline knelt beside a low wooden chest near the corner of the room, tasked with folding the newly purchased winter linens. As she lifted the heavy wooden lid, her calloused fingers brushed against a hidden, false bottom. The thin wooden panel slipped aside. Beneath it lay a carefully wrapped package of faded linen. A profound, overwhelming curiosity guided her thick hands. She gently unwrapped the fabric, exposing a collection of tiny, beautiful objects. Resting in her massive palm was a perfectly preserved, miniature wooden horse, intricately carved with breathtaking skill. Beside it lay a tiny, hand-stitched yellow dress, far too small for any child over the age of 3. And tucked beneath the dress was a beautiful silver locket containing a lock of fine, golden hair. A heavy, quiet footstep sounded behind her. Emmeline froze, her broad back tensing instinctively. She expected anger. She expected the fiercely private mountain man to demand she drop the sacred items. Instead, Callahan slowly descended to the wooden floorboards, folding his towering, heavy frame until he knelt directly beside her. The flickering orange light of the fire washed over his weathered, sun-bronzed face, revealing a profound vulnerability he had hidden from the entire world. The winter fever took them both. The deep, rumbling voice of the rancher was barely a harsh whisper. He stared directly at the tiny yellow dress, his observant eyes entirely clouded by the ghosts of his past. 7 years ago. The snow was too deep to reach the town doctor. I chopped a mountain of firewood. I kept the stove burning white hot for 6 straight days. I used every ounce of my physical strength to fight the cold, but I could not fight the sickness. He reached out, his massive trembling hand gently tracing the carved edge of the wooden horse. A man can possess the strength to lift a collapsing barn roof, or the power to break a wild stallion, he murmured, the absolute defeat ringing clearly in his quiet tone. But when the fever enters the lungs of your child, all of that brute strength becomes utterly, terrifyingly useless. You are left completely powerless. You are left behind to haunt an empty cabin. Emmeline felt the immense, heavy walls guarding her scarred heart completely crumble. The profound emotional redemption of his confession shattered her defensive isolation. They were 2 towering, massively built giants, forged by brutal labor and blessed with overwhelming physical power. Yet both of them had been utterly broken by the quiet, fragile tragedies of life. The deep mutual understanding forged an instant, powerful emotional attachment between them. She did not hesitate. The giant, heavily muscular mother slowly reached out. She placed her massive, calloused hand directly over his trembling fingers. The physical touch between them was a monumental shift. Her thick, powerful hand offered no romantic expectation, only the absolute steadying strength of a fellow survivor. Callahan slowly turned his head. His sharp eyes met hers. For the first time, he did not look away. He allowed the towering woman to see the full, bleeding truth of his shattered soul. Your little girl knows too much about the darkness of this world, the stoic cowboy spoke softly, his observant eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her resolute face. She asked if my child knew how to hide from the monsters. It takes a very specific, terrifying kind of monster to force a mother to flee across the frozen plains in the dead of winter. Emmeline felt her thick blood run instantly cold. The comforting warmth of the fire suddenly vanished from her massive chest. Callahan gently turned his large hand, lacing his thick fingers loosely with hers. I saw the bounty paper in the barn. Emmeline, they're offering $200 silver for your immediate return. No greedy merchant offers that kind of staggering wealth for a simple runaway laborer. The rancher leaned slightly closer, his deep voice carrying the protective, heavy promise of an incoming storm. What did you actually take from them, and why are they truly hunting you? Emmeline stared into the flickering fire, her powerful physique trembling with a sudden, overwhelming dread. What terrifying truth about her past was the giant mother still keeping entirely hidden in the dark? Emmeline stared directly into the flickering flames of the iron stove, the terrifying truth of her past rising in her throat like swallowed glass. She slowly opened her mouth, preparing to finally speak the unspeakable, preparing to watch the profound emotional attachment in his sharp, observant eyes curdle into absolute horror. She drew a deep, shaking breath, her massive chest rising heavily. Before a single word could escape her lips, a deafening, explosive crack of splintering timber completely shattered the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. The violent sound was immediately followed by the frantic, terrified bellowing of massive animals. Callahan was on his feet in a fraction of a second, the heavy sorrow of his past instantly buried beneath the urgent, demanding instincts of a frontier guardian. He rushed to the frosted window, wiping away the condensation with his calloused hand. "The main holding pen," the rancher commanded, his deep voice completely devoid of panic but laced with absolute urgency. "The cold has snapped the iron bindings. The herd is breaking through the fence line. If they reach the frozen river gorge in the dark, they will blindly fall to their deaths." Emmeline did not ask questions. The heavy, suffocating dread of her impending confession was instantly replaced by raw, surging adrenaline. She grabbed her thick woolen coat from the wooden peg, shrugging her heavily muscular shoulders into the fabric. She kissed the forehead of her sleeping daughter, ensuring the child remained safely tucked away in the warmth, and bolted out the heavy timber door right behind the solitary cowboy. The night air was a brutal, freezing slap to the face. The harsh winter winds had returned, whipping loose snow across the dark yard like blinding shards of broken glass. By the light of a single violently swinging lantern, the absolute chaos of the broken fence became visible. A massive section of the heavy wooden corral had completely collapsed. A dense, panicking mass of heavy longhorn cattle was surging toward the gaping hole, driven wild by the freezing wind and the terrifying darkness. Callahan drove his heavy leather boots deep into the snow, throwing his towering, powerful frame directly into the gap. He waved his massive arms, shouting guttural commands to turn the leaders of the stampede back into the pen. However, the sheer weight of the frightened herd was entirely overwhelming. They were pressing forward, threatening to trample the stoic rancher into the frozen earth. Emmeline surged into the breach beside him. She did not flinch from the massive, thrashing beasts. The giant mother widened her stance, her chunky leather boots finding absolute purchase in the slippery mud. As a massive, terrified steer attempted to push past her, she lunged forward. She wrapped her thick, powerful arms directly around the heavy neck of the animal. Every sculpted, heavily developed muscle across her broad back and massive biceps locked into solid iron. With a devastating, explosive burst of raw physical strength, she forcefully wrestled the massive beast backward, physically halting its desperate escape. Callahan watched her through the swirling snow, his sharp eyes widening in profound, absolute awe. They were entirely surrounded by deadly chaos, freezing winds, and 1,000 pounds of thrashing muscle, yet he had never seen anything as magnificent as the towering woman fighting by his side. She was a fierce, unstoppable force of nature, protecting his livelihood with the exact same ruthless devotion she used to protect her own child. The shared hardship bonded them instantly in the brutal dark. They moved together with a beautiful, wordless synchronicity. While Callahan used his broad shoulders and commanding presence to push the frantic herd back toward the center of the pen, Emmeline turned her attention to the shattered fence. She waded through the deep snow, grabbing the massive, heavy logs that had fallen to the earth. These were dense, waterlogged pine trunks that normally required a team of draft horses to drag. Emmeline did not hesitate. She bent her thick, powerful thighs, gripped the rough bark with her large hands, and hoisted the massive timber over her broad shoulders. She carried the immense weight through the freezing mud, slamming the thick posts back into their deep earthen holes. The grueling, dangerous labor continued for over an hour. The bitter cold burned their lungs, and their thick muscles screamed under the relentless exertion. Yet an overwhelming, powerful admiration blossomed deeply within the chest of the solitary rancher. He had lived his entire life believing he had to carry the heavy burdens of the world completely alone. Now, he stood shoulder to shoulder with a giant woman who matched his towering strength, completely understanding the silent, stoic language of survival. They hoisted the final massive crossbeam together. Callahan held the left side, his thick muscles straining under the heavy canvas shirt, while Emmeline supported the right side with shocking, effortless grace. They locked their eyes over the splintered wood, sharing a profound, heavy breath of mutual respect. They had beaten the storm. They had saved the herd. Suddenly, a massive, terrifying shadow detached from the dark corner of the pen. A rogue, heavily scarred bull, completely blinded by panic and thoroughly disoriented by the swinging lantern, charged wildly toward the newly repaired gap. The massive beast lowered its heavy, dangerous horns, aiming directly for the towering woman holding the wooden beam. Callahan moved purely on absolute protective instinct. He did not shout a warning. The stoic cowboy violently shoved his broad shoulder against the heavy timber, propelling himself directly into the path of the charging beast. The impact was absolutely deafening. The immense weight of the wild bull slammed directly into the stoic rancher. The sheer force drove Callahan backward, crushing his powerful frame brutally against the jagged, splintered remains of the heavy wooden fence post. A sickening, terrifying crack of breaking bone echoed above the howling wind. The bull scrambled wildly, its heavy hooves tearing up the frozen mud before it finally retreated into the dark center of the herd. Callahan collapsed entirely to the freezing earth. His heavy leather boots slid weakly in the snow. He did not cry out, but a sharp, agonizing gasp tore from his lips. He clutched his lower side, his massive body folding agonizingly as a dark, terrifying stain began to rapidly spread across his weathered canvas shirt. Emmeline dropped the massive timber. She fell to her knees in the freezing mud, her large hands hovering over his bleeding side, absolute terror gripping her scarred heart. They were completely alone. The town was miles away through an impassable blizzard, and the silent protector who had sheltered them was rapidly bleeding out into the unforgiving mountain snow. How could she possibly save the life of the only man who had ever shown her absolute mercy? The freezing mountain wind howled across the dark corral, but Emmeline heard nothing except the ragged, shallow breathing of the towering mountain man lying heavily in the snow. She did not waste a single second screaming for help. There was absolutely no one coming to save them. If Callahan remained in the bitter cold for another 10 minutes, the shock and the freezing temperatures would steal his life long before the bleeding did. The giant mother slid her thick, heavily muscular arms entirely beneath his broad shoulders and his heavy thighs. Callahan was a massive, densely built frontier man, possessing a physical weight that would have firmly anchored two ordinary men to the earth. Emmeline did not hesitate. She locked her powerful, sculpted back, braced her heavy leather boots against the frozen mud, and unleashed a guttural groan of pure, desperate strength. She hoisted the solitary cowboy completely off the ground, cradling his immense frame against her broad chest as if he weighed nothing more than a fragile child. She carried him through the blinding blizzard, her powerful legs driving through the deep drifts with unstoppable purpose. She kicked the heavy timber door of the cabin open, bringing a violent swirl of white snow into the warm sanctuary. Little Clara remained fast asleep in the heavy rocking chair, blissfully unaware of the terrifying violence that had just unfolded. Emmeline moved quickly, lowering the stoic rancher gently onto the thick braided rug directly in front of the radiating iron stove. Callahan released a harsh, jagged breath, his weathered face turning a dangerous shade of pale ash. His large, calloused hand remained clamped tightly over his lower right side, attempting to stem the dark flow soaking through his heavy canvas shirt. Emmeline rushed to the iron wash basin. She poured hot water from the heavy kettle, quickly retrieving a bar of harsh lye soap and the clean, folded linens she had discovered earlier. She dropped to her heavy knees beside him. The raw, primal terror of losing the only man who had ever offered her a sanctuary made her massive hands tremble violently. "Move your hand!" Her thick voice was a sharp, commanding rasp, echoing her intense desperation. Callahan slowly pulled his hand away, his sharp, observant eyes remaining completely fixed upon her resolute face. He did not look at the terrifying wound. He only looked at her. Emmeline carefully gripped the hem of his torn canvas shirt. With one swift, powerful motion, she ripped the heavy fabric entirely down the seam, exposing the massive, heavily muscled expanse of his broad chest and the deep, ugly laceration along his lower ribs. The jagged, splintered wood of the broken fence post had torn a devastating gash across his thick flesh, heavily bruising the heavy bone beneath. It was a brutal, terrifying injury. She submerged the clean linen into the steaming water, wringing it out with her thick, powerful fingers. As she leaned over his massive frame, she suddenly hesitated. Her heart pounded violently against her heavy ribs. For her entire life, she had been ruthlessly told that her massive size made her a clumsy, dangerous brute. Society feared the devastating power of her heavy hands. She was absolutely terrified that her immense physical strength would only cause him further agony. The stoic cowboy saw the profound hesitation deeply written across her strong features. He read the devastating fear in her eyes. Callahan slowly reached up, his large, blood-stained fingers gently wrapped around her thick, powerful wrist. "Do not stop." His deep voice was a ragged, strained whisper, yet it carried an absolute, unwavering certainty. "I trust your hands, Emmeline." The sheer magnitude of that simple validation completely shattered the remaining defensive walls surrounding her scarred heart. He did not see a monster. He saw a fierce protector. He saw a gentle woman possessing the exact strength required to save his life. Emmeline swallowed the heavy knot of emotion in her throat. She pressed the hot, wet linen carefully against the terrible wound. Her touch was a startling contradiction. She possessed the raw physical power to crush heavy stone, yet she cleansed his torn flesh with the absolute delicate precision of a master artisan. She wiped away the freezing mud and the dark blood, moving with a profound, quiet grace that completely mesmerized the injured rancher. As she worked, the heavy physical proximity between them exposed a startling, raw vulnerability. Their massive, deeply guarded souls were stripped entirely bare in the flickering light of the fire. Callahan watched the intense concentration on her beautiful, resolute face. He noted the heavy, shifting muscles of her massive shoulders, completely exposed by the torn elements of her rugged gray dress. He felt the radiating, grounding heat of her towering presence. She was not a wild beast. She was a magnificent, unparalleled force of pure devotion. Emmeline retrieved a heavy needle and a length of sterilized silk thread from his medical kit. "This will bring terrible pain," she murmured softly, her thick voice breaking slightly. "Then I am deeply fortunate that you are the one holding the needle." The solitary cowboy offered a faint, weary smile, surrendering his absolute trust entirely to her. She worked quickly, her large hands securing the torn flesh with beautiful, neat stitches. When she finally finished, she bound his broad chest tightly with heavy strips of clean white linen. She wrapped her massive, thickly muscled arms entirely around his heavy torso to firmly secure the bandages, pulling him gently against her broad chest. For one brief, suspended moment, Callahan rested his tired head against her heavy shoulder. The profound emotional safety they shared blossomed into something entirely breathtaking. The overwhelming admiration between the two giants had thoroughly melted into a raw, undeniable vulnerability. They were simply a man and a woman finding profound emotional warmth in the coldest depths of the winter frontier. Emmeline carefully lowered him back onto the rug, pulling a thick woolen blanket securely over his heavily muscled chest. She brushed a stray lock of unkempt hair away from his weathered brow, allowing her thick fingers to linger gently against his warm skin. The storm outside suddenly dropped into an eerie, total silence. The violent howling wind abruptly ceased. In that sudden, absolute quiet, a new sound instantly froze the warm blood in her heavy veins. It was the distinct rhythmic crunch of heavy horses approaching through the deep snow. It was not a single solitary rider. The heavy hoofbeats belonged to a dozen determined men surrounding the isolated cabin in the dead of the freezing night. Who had braved the deadly mountain blizzard to hunt them down? The distinct crunch of heavy boots sinking into the frozen snow echoed loudly through the thick wooden walls. Emmeline felt the beautiful, warm sanctuary of the cabin instantly shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her massive, heavily muscular frame froze perfectly still in the center of the braided rug. The profound vulnerability she shared with the rancher evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying fear of absolute loss. She looked down at Callahan. The stoic mountain man was severely injured, his sun-bronzed face dangerously pale from the sudden blood loss. If the ruthless men outside discovered she was hiding here, they would not hesitate to burn the entire property directly to the ground. They would happily kill the silent protector just to claim their heavy silver bounty. She could not allow him to die for her. Emmeline moved with silent, desperate speed. She rushed to the wooden rocking chair. She carefully lifted the sleeping form of little Clara, wrapping the woolen blankets tightly around the child. She carried her daughter to the darkest corner of the cabin, hiding her safely behind a massive wooden wardrobe. A heavy, violent pounding suddenly struck the thick timber door. The heavy iron hinges groaned painfully under the brutal force. "Open the door, Callahan!" A harsh, cruel voice shouted from the freezing dark. "We know you are inside. We saw the smoke from your chimney. Open the door in the name of the law, or we will break it down." Emmeline recognized that vicious, grating voice immediately. A wave of nauseating dread washed over her resolute face. It was Silas Thorne, the ruthless chief enforcer for the Eastern Labor Company. He was a man who took cruel pleasure in hunting down escaped laborers, dragging them back in heavy iron chains to face brutal punishment. Society did not care how utterly cruel the masters were. The law only protected the greedy men who held the heavy gold. It was a profound betrayal by a society that viewed her massive physique as nothing more than profitable machinery. She looked frantically around the room, her thick, calloused hands reaching for the heavy iron fire poker resting beside the stove. She would absolutely fight them. She would unleash the overwhelming power of her heavy muscles and tear them apart with her bare hands before she let them touch her daughter. But there were a dozen armed men outside. Even her giant strength could not stop a dozen flying rifle bullets. A massive, heavy hand suddenly gripped her thick ankle. Emmeline gasped, looking down at the braided rug. Callahan was awake. The stoic cowboy was gritting his teeth in absolute agony, his sharp, observant eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. He forced himself to roll onto his uninjured side. The muscles of his broad back trembled violently as he fought the excruciating pain radiating from his shattered ribs. "Do not move." His deep voice was a strained, ragged whisper, yet it commanded absolute authority. "Stay perfectly still in the shadows." "I cannot let you do this," Emmeline breathed, her thick voice breaking completely with raw, desperate terror. "They will kill you. You are bleeding. You cannot fight a dozen men. I am not going to fight them." Callahan pressed his large, calloused hand against the heavy iron stove, using it to slowly, agonizingly pull his towering frame upward from the floor. His weathered face was twisted in profound pain, and fresh, dark blood began to slowly seep through the clean, white linen bandages. "I am going to do exactly what I promised. I am going to protect you and the child." The heavy pounding on the door resumed, much louder and far more violent this time. "Callahan, do not test my patience. We are freezing out here, and we are heavily armed." The towering rancher reached for a clean, heavy canvas jacket resting on the back of a wooden chair. He carefully slid his thick, muscular arms into the sleeves, buttoning the heavy fabric up to his throat to completely hide the bloody bandages. He picked up his worn leather gun belt from the wooden table, expertly strapping the heavy iron revolver around his narrow waist. Despite his devastating injury, he transformed instantly back into the imposing mountain man who commanded absolute respect. Emmeline watched him, her heavy heart pounding violently against her ribs. The terrifying fear of loss completely consumed her heavy soul. She had finally found a man who looked at her towering, muscular physique and saw profound beauty instead of a monster. She had finally found a safe, warm hearth for her daughter. And now she was about to watch him march directly toward his own death just to buy them a few precious moments of time. Callahan walked slowly toward the heavy timber door, each step clearly costing him a staggering amount of physical energy. He paused, looking back over his broad, powerful shoulder. He met the terrified gaze of the giant mother hiding in the dark corner. He offered a single slow nod of absolute unwavering reassurance. He reached out and completely unlatched the heavy iron bolt. The violent winter wind instantly ripped the door open. Silas Thorne stood on the wooden porch, his cruel face wrapped tightly in a wool scarf. A repeating rifle gripped in his gloved hands. Behind him, the dark, snowy yard was completely filled with heavily armed men mounted on exhausted, steaming horses. They carried bright, violent kerosene torches that cast dancing, hellish shadows against the blinding white snow. "What is the meaning of this absolute chaos, Thorne?" Callahan demanded. His deep, rumbling voice showed absolutely no trace of his excruciating pain. He filled the doorway with his massive frame, completely blocking the armed men from seeing into the dim cabin. Silas Thorne sneered, lowering his heavy rifle just a fraction of an inch. "We are hunting a dangerous fugitive, Callahan. A giant, wildly muscular beast of a woman. She broke her legal labor contract and fled into the mountains. We tracked a heavy draft wagon from the town of Oak Creek directly to your property line." Thorne stepped closer, his cruel, calculating eyes attempting to peer past the broad shoulders of the stoic rancher. "The townspeople said you defended this giant monster in the middle of the street. They said you brought her here. The legal penalty for harboring a fugitive is 5 years in a federal cage or a rope hanging from the nearest tree. Now, step aside and let my men search your property." The bitter wind howled loudly around the quiet cabin. Inside, Emmeline held her breath, clutching the heavy iron poker with white-knuckled desperation. She prepared her massive body for the inevitable violence, ready to lay down her life to save the silent protector. Callahan stood perfectly still in the freezing doorway. He was bleeding, outnumbered, and facing ruthless men who would gladly put a rifle bullet through his chest. Will the stoic mountain man risk his entire livelihood, his absolute freedom, and his very life to lie directly to these dangerous armed men? Listen closely, for this is the moment the true weight of devotion was forged in the bitter mountain cold. Callahan did not step aside. He did not draw the heavy iron revolver strapped to his narrow waist, nor did he raise his deep voice above the howling winter wind. He simply stood in the doorway, a towering, bleeding fortress of absolute resolve. The violent kerosene torches cast flickering, demonic shadows across his stoic face, but his sharp, observant eyes remained perfectly cold and entirely unyielding. "You have tracked a wagon to my property line, Thorne," Callahan rumbled, his tone carrying the lethal, quiet danger of a coiled rattlesnake. "You have trespassed onto my land in the dead of night with armed men, but you will absolutely not cross my threshold." Thorne let out a harsh, mocking laugh, aiming his repeating rifle directly at the broad chest of the rancher. "Do not play the fool, Callahan. The law gives me the right to reclaim stolen property. If you are hiding that giant muscular beast inside your cabin, you are harboring a federal fugitive. There is no fugitive inside my home." The stoic cowboy shifted his massive frame slightly, deliberately blocking any angle that might reveal the dark interior of the cabin. "There is only my family." Thorne frowned, his cruel eyes narrowing with absolute suspicion. "Your family? You live alone, Callahan. The entire town of Oak Creek knows you have been a solitary hermit for 7 long years." "Men change," Callahan answered, his deep voice ringing with unwavering authority. "The towering woman you saw in town today is not a runaway laborer. She is not a beast of burden. She is Emmeline, and she is my legally contracted wife. We finalized the proxy agreement 2 weeks ago through the territorial magistrate." The sheer audacity of the lie hung heavily in the freezing air. Inside the dim cabin, Emmeline felt her massive heart skip a violent beat. She lowered the heavy iron poker, completely stunned by the profound magnitude of his words. He was using the absolute strongest shield available in the Western Territories. By frontier law, a legally contracted marriage completely voided any prior indentured labor agreements for a woman. A wife belonged entirely to her new household, completely untouchable by Eastern debt collectors without a direct order from a federal judge. Thorne gritted his teeth in absolute fury. He knew the complex laws of the territory. If he ordered his men to force their way into the home of a legally married frontier rancher without a signed warrant, the local deputies would hunt him down for murder and trespassing. The heavy silver bounty was simply not worth a hanging. "You are lying," Thorne spat, his voice laced with bitter venom. No sane man would willingly chain himself to a monstrous giant woman like that. "I want to see the legal papers. I want to see proof of this ridiculous marriage." Callahan stepped forward, moving his heavy leather boots completely out onto the snowy porch. He closed the heavy timber door slightly behind him, ensuring the bitter wind did not reach the injured child inside. He towered over the cruel enforcer, radiating a terrifying, suffocating pressure. "You will not see anything tonight except the barrel of my revolver if you do not immediately remove your men from my property," Callahan commanded softly. "If you want proof, ride back to Oak Creek. Speak to the magistrate yourself, but if you or your men ever approach my wife or her daughter again, I will not bother calling for the local sheriff. I will bury you deeply beneath the mountain snow." The dozen armed men shifted nervously in their heavy saddles. They looked at the towering, fiercely protective mountain man, completely recognizing the absolute truth in his sharp eyes. He was a man thoroughly prepared to die, and he would surely take half of them to the grave with him. Thorne stared at Callahan for a long, tense moment. He slowly lowered his repeating rifle. "This is not over, Callahan." Thorne pulled his thick wool scarf tightly around his cruel face. "I will verify this supposed marriage. If I find out you are lying, I will return with a federal judge and a heavily armed cavalry detachment. We will burn this entire ranch to the ashes." Thorne turned roughly, waving his gloved hand. The heavily armed men turned their exhausted horses, riding slowly back into the blinding blizzard. The violent kerosene torches faded into the dark, leaving the isolated cabin completely immersed in the quiet, howling snow. Callahan watched them disappear. He stood perfectly still on the freezing porch until the very last heavy hoofbeat vanished into the wind. Then, the immense, unbreakable strength of the stoic cowboy completely gave way. The heavy timber door swung open. Callahan stumbled backward into the warm cabin, his massive frame completely collapsing toward the wooden floorboards. Emmeline surged forward from the shadows. She dropped the heavy iron poker and threw her thick, heavily muscular arms completely around his broad shoulders, catching his crushing weight before he struck the earth. She lowered him gently back onto the braided rug, her large hands trembling violently. Fresh dark blood was heavily soaking through the clean canvas jacket, indicating his torn ribs had started bleeding profusely again. "You foolish, brave man," Emmeline breathed heavily, her thick voice completely choked with raw emotion. She quickly unbuttoned the canvas jacket, pressing a clean linen cloth firmly against the fresh blood. "You risked everything. You bound your own clean name to a hunted woman." Callahan released a harsh, ragged breath. He looked up at her towering, resolute face. The harsh light of the iron stove illuminated the profound, beautiful devotion shining brightly in her sharp eyes. "I bound my name to the bravest woman I have ever known," the solitary rancher murmured softly, lifting his large, trembling hand to gently touch her cheek. "You are safe now, Emmeline. They cannot touch my wife." The word hung heavily between them in the quiet, warm cabin. Wife. The terrifying fear of absolute loss that had gripped her scarred heart only moments ago slowly melted away. In its place, a beautiful, intense, romantic longing blossomed deeply within her broad chest. This massive, stoic protector had not merely defended her, he had legally claimed her before the entire world. He had given her a name, a home, and a permanent sanctuary. She looked down at his weathered, sun-bronzed face, feeling the radiating heat of his large hand against her skin. The profound emotional distance between the two towering giants had completely vanished. thoroughly replaced by a heavy, breathless intimacy. They were no longer simply a solitary cowboy and a desperate runaway. They were permanently, legally bound together in the eyes of the ruthless frontier law. However, a new terrifying emotional weight settled firmly over the giant mother. Callahan had claimed her to save her life, but it was merely a desperate lie meant to deceive cruel men. How would these two guarded, heavily scarred survivors face each other behind closed doors now that they were forced to wear the intimate, heavy mask of husband and wife? The heavy breathing of the injured mountain man finally settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The violent winter wind continued to batter the thick wooden walls of the cabin, but inside, a breathless, heavy quiet completely filled the room. Emmeline knelt upon the braided rug, her chunky leather boots tucked beneath her massive frame. She watched the slow rise and fall of the broad chest of the rancher. The fresh linen bandages held firm, but the terrifying reality of the night hung over them like a dark, suffocating storm cloud. The stoic protector had lied to a dozen armed men. He had bound his own clean name to a hunted fugitive, invoking the sacred, profound title of husband simply to shield her from a brutal cage. Callahan slowly opened his sharp, observant eyes. The flickering orange light of the iron stove danced across his weathered, sun-bronzed face. He did not speak. He merely watched the towering woman sitting beside him. He saw the profound, heavy burden crushing her strong shoulders. He demanded absolutely nothing, yet his quiet, steady presence offered an open door that her scarred heart could no longer ignore. She could not allow this honorable man to risk his very life without knowing the exact, terrifying truth of what he was protecting. Emmeline swallowed the jagged knot of fear trapped deeply in her throat. She looked down at her massive, calloused hands. "They called me a beast of burden." Her thick voice broke the heavy silence, trembling with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "I was born into a heavy debt held by the Eastern Labor Company. When I grew taller and far broader than the men in the camps, they stopped looking at me as a human being. They saw only profitable machinery." Callahan remained perfectly still, listening to the quiet devastation pouring from the soul of the giant mother. "They worked me in the deep iron quarries," Emmeline continued, thick, heavy tears beginning to well in her resolute eyes. "They forced me to haul massive carts of dense rock. They used heavy iron chains to bind my wrists. If I slowed down, they used the whip. They built this staggering, heavy muscle across my broad back through pure, relentless cruelty." She wrapped her thick, powerful arms around her own heavy torso, attempting to hold her shattering heart together. "I desperately wanted to be a mother. I wanted to be a soft, gentle woman for my child. But they laughed at me. They mocked my towering height. They mocked the heavy thickness of my biceps and the sheer width of my shoulders. They made me believe I was a grotesque, unnatural monster, completely unworthy of simple grace." The heavy tears finally spilled over her strong cheeks, dropping silently onto the rugged gray fabric of her torn dress. The profound indignity she had suffered for a decade completely flooded the quiet cabin. She bared the most painful, hidden wounds of her soul to the silent cowboy, exposing the absolute terror that dictated her every waking breath. "The night we fled," her voice dropped into a harsh, ragged whisper, "the cruel overseers came to our quarters. They intended to take little Clara. They wanted to put her small, fragile hands into the dangerous gears of the textile mills to pay off the remainder of the debt. I could not allow it." Emmeline looked directly into the sharp eyes of the stoic rancher, forcing herself to reveal the violent truth. "I became the exact monster they always claimed I was," she confessed, her massive frame shaking violently. "I used my devastating physical strength to tear the heavy iron bolts directly from the stone walls. I shattered the wooden doors. I struck the guards with my bare, heavy hands. I stole a heavy draft wagon and drove the horses until they collapsed. I am a violent, hunted criminal, and I have brought the ruthless wrath of those cruel men directly to your peaceful hearth." She bowed her head, waiting for the inevitable disgust. She waited for the solitary rancher to realize the terrible mistake he had made by claiming such a dangerous, broken creature as his wife. A large, warm hand suddenly touched her tear-stained cheek. Emmeline gasped, lifting her resolute face. Callahan had forced his towering, injured frame upward just enough to reach her. His sun-bronzed face held absolutely no disgust. There was no fear. There was only a profound, breathtaking reverence shining deeply within his sharp eyes. "You are not a monster, Emmeline." The deep, rumbling voice of the mountain man washed over her battered soul like a soothing summer rain. "You are a mother who possessed the extraordinary, fierce courage to protect her child when the entire world abandoned you. You used the heavy strength God gave you to break the chains of cruelty." He gently wiped a heavy tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb. "The men who treated you like a beast are the true monsters," Callahan murmured softly, his tone laced with absolute, unwavering conviction. "You carry no sin in this cabin. You carry absolute dignity. And I have never seen a more magnificent, beautiful woman in my entire life." The staggering weight of that profound forgiveness completely broke the final defensive wall guarding her heavy heart. The intense romantic longing she felt for this stoic protector instantly solidified into a deep, unbreakable emotional dependence. She did not merely want to stay on the isolated ranch. She desperately needed this quiet, honorable man to anchor her deeply wounded soul. Emmeline leaned heavily into his warm palm, allowing herself to completely surrender to the emotional safety he provided. They remained together on the braided rug, listening to the fading storm outside, until complete exhaustion finally pulled the giant mother into a deep, dreamless sleep beside the iron stove. When the pale, freezing light of the morning finally pierced the frosted windows, Emmeline opened her heavy eyes. The iron stove was reduced to glowing orange embers. The thick woolen blanket remained carefully tucked around her broad shoulders, but the braided rug beside her was completely empty. Emmeline sat up rapidly, cold panic flooding her heavy veins. She pushed herself up from the wooden floorboards and rushed to the heavy timber door. She threw it open, ignoring the bitter morning chill. The tracks of a single heavy horse cut deeply through the fresh snow, leading directly away from the isolated valley and pointing straight toward the dangerous mountain pass. The roan stallion was missing. The stoic protector had ridden away in the dead of the freezing morning without waking her. He had ridden away without leaving a single spoken word. Had the heavy, terrifying reality of her massive debt and the deadly threat of the armed men finally forced the honorable rancher to completely abandon them. Emmeline stood on the freezing wooden porch, staring at the solitary trail of horse tracks cutting deeply through the fresh morning snow. A suffocating, crippling doubt instantly crushed her massive chest. The terrifying reality of her situation hit her with the devastating force of a physical blow. She had bared her heavily scarred soul to the stoic mountain man. She had confessed the shameful truth of her massive debt, her violent escape, and the brutal men hunting her. In the harsh light of day, the honorable rancher had clearly realized the immense danger she brought to his quiet hearth. She believed he had abandoned them. She believed her terrifying past was simply too heavy for any mortal man to carry. The giant mother retreated into the cabin, her thick, powerful legs feeling as heavy as solid lead. She did not cry. She had spent a decade learning how to bury her absolute devastation behind a wall of pure mountain granite. Emmeline woke little Clara, fed the fragile child a warm bowl of oats, and immediately set to work. She required the grueling, punishing distraction of heavy labor to keep her shattered heart from completely stopping. She marched out into the bitter cold. She carried massive bales of hay to the surviving cattle. She used her thick, heavily muscular arms to chop a staggering mountain of firewood, swinging the heavy iron maul with a fierce, desperate rhythm. Every strike of the steel against the frozen timber echoed the agonizing throb of her crippling doubt. She possessed the extraordinary, overwhelming physical strength to break heavy iron chains, yet she was utterly powerless to stop the only man she deeply cared for from riding away. The long agonizing hours crawled by. The pale winter sun slowly dipped toward the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the snowy yard. Suddenly, a distant, rhythmic crunch echoed through the quiet valley. Emmeline dropped the heavy iron maul. She turned her resolute face toward the dangerous mountain pass. Emerging from the deep shadows of the timberline was the heavy, roan stallion. The massive beast was utterly exhausted, its thick winter coat completely covered in freezing sweat. Slumped heavily in the leather saddle was the towering, solitary cowboy. Callahan had not abandoned them. Emmeline surged forward, her chunky leather boots tearing through the deep snowdrifts with unstoppable speed. She reached the exhausted stallion just as the stoic rancher attempted to dismount. His heavy leather boots slipped from the iron stirrup. His massive frame swayed violently, completely lacking the strength to remain upright. She caught him instantly. She wrapped her thick, deeply muscled arms firmly around his broad shoulders, taking his immense physical weight completely onto her own powerful frame. As she pressed against him, she felt the terrifying, wet warmth soaking completely through the side of his heavy canvas jacket. He had ridden for miles through a brutal winter storm with shattered, bleeding ribs. "You absolute foolish man," Emmeline breathed heavily, her thick voice breaking completely with raw, agonizing relief. "You are bleeding to death. Why did you leave the safety of the hearth?" Callahan leaned heavily against her towering shoulder. His sun-bronzed face was an alarming shade of pale gray, and his sharp, observant eyes were clouded with complete exhaustion. Yet a faint, beautiful smile touched the corners of his weathered lips. "I had a debt to settle," the deep, rumbling voice of the mountain man rasped against her ear. She practically carried him across the freezing yard and back into the warm sanctuary of the cabin. She lowered his towering frame gently onto the braided rug beside the glowing iron stove. She immediately began working to stop the fresh bleeding, her large, calloused hands moving with desperate, frantic precision. As she reached for the clean linen bandages, Callahan slowly raised his heavy, trembling hand. He stopped her frantic movements. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of heavy parchment. He pressed the documents directly into her massive palm. Emmeline looked down. The top document bore the cruel, familiar seal of the Eastern Labor Company. It was her original indentured contract, the very paper that legally bound her as a beast of burden. But across the heavy black ink, a massive, bright red stamp had been violently pressed. "Paid in full. Legally released." "I rode into Oak Creek," Callahan murmured softly, his chest heaving with the agonizing pain of his shattered ribs. "I found Silas Thorne drinking in the local saloon. I threw the entire contents of my federal iron vault directly onto his table. Every single silver dollar I possessed, every ounce of gold I saved over the last 7 years. I purchased the deed to your absolute freedom, Emmeline. They have absolutely no legal right to hunt you ever again." The heavy parchment slipped from her trembling fingers. The giant mother stared at the stoic cowboy, completely unable to process the staggering magnitude of his sacrifice. He had surrendered his entire life savings. He had emptied his secure future, risking his own physical survival, simply to buy a hunted, broken woman a second chance at a peaceful life. "You gave them everything," she whispered, her voice completely choked with heavy tears. "You ruined yourself for a woman you barely know." Callahan reached up, his large fingers gently tracing the strong line of her resolute jaw. "I did not ruin myself, Emmeline. I finally built something worth keeping. I did not buy a laborer. I permanently secured the safety of my wife and my daughter. The crippling doubt that had tortured her soul all day completely vanished. It was instantly, beautifully replaced by a profound, breathtaking, emotional safety. This honorable mountain man had looked at her massive, wildly muscular physique and saw a woman entirely worthy of absolute devotion. She leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his, allowing her heavy tears to fall freely onto his weathered cheek. She finally belonged somewhere. However, the second piece of parchment resting on the wooden floorboards carried a different, much heavier seal. Callahan closed his eyes, drawing a slow, painful breath. Thorne accepted the silver, but he is a deeply cruel, vindictive man. He went immediately to the territorial magistrate. He formally challenged the validity of our sudden marriage. Emmeline lifted her head, a cold spike of fear piercing her newfound safety. The magistrate sent that letter. the solitary rancher explained quietly. Oak Creek is hosting the Grand Winter Festival in exactly 3 days. The entire community will gather. The magistrate demands that we attend the festival together. He demands public, undeniable proof that our marriage is genuine, forged by true affection, and not a desperate legal trick. The stoic protector opened his sharp eyes, looking deeply into her worried face. If we cannot completely convince the town and the judge that we are truly in love, Thorne will have the federal court void the marriage. He will claim I purchased you illegally, and he will demand you are returned to the iron chains. They had survived the deadly winter storm and the immediate threat of violence. But how could a wildly muscular, socially terrified giant and a fiercely isolated, stoic mountain man possibly convince an entire, judging town that they were passionately in love? For 3 agonizing days, the bitter cold firmly gripped the isolated mountain valley. Emmeline dedicated every waking moment to nursing the shattered ribs of the stoic cowboy, applying warm poultices and ensuring he remained perfectly still. The heavy, terrifying pressure of the impending winter festival loomed over them like a dark, suffocating shadow. They were expected to walk into the grand assembly hall of Oak Creek and prove their profound affection before the harsh, judging eyes of civilized society. If they failed to convince the territorial magistrate, the ruthless men of the Eastern Labor Company would legally tear them apart. On the evening of the grand festival, a tense, heavy silence completely filled the warm cabin. Emmeline stood near the iron stove, scrubbing the dirt from her calloused hands. She wore her ragged, heavily torn gray dress, fully expecting to face the mockery of the entire town wearing the exact garments of a runaway laborer. Callahan slowly pushed his towering frame upward from the wooden chair. His movements were incredibly stiff, his broad chest heavily bound in clean linen, but his sharp, observant eyes burned with a clear, undeniable purpose. He walked slowly toward his large wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. He opened the heavy lid and carefully lifted a massive wrapped parcel. He carried the bundle across the braided rug and gently placed it onto the wooden table. I purchased this during our first trip into Oak Creek. The deep, rumbling voice of the mountain man filled the quiet room. Before the bounty men arrived, before the storm, I saw how the small-minded men stared at you, and I wanted you to possess armor worthy of your absolute dignity. Emmeline approached the wooden table, her thick, powerful fingers trembling slightly as she untied the heavy twine. She pulled back the brown paper. Resting inside was a magnificent, breathtaking dress crafted from deep, rich crimson wool. It was not a delicate, fragile garment meant for a small, fainting woman. It was a masterpiece meticulously designed to honor a towering, heavily muscular physique. It possessed a wide, elegant neckline that would perfectly frame her massive shoulders, and the sleeves were tailored wide enough to comfortably accommodate the devastating thickness of her powerful biceps. "You did not have to do this," Emmeline whispered, her thick voice breaking completely. "Put it on, Emmeline," Callahan commanded softly, his sun-bronzed face reflecting absolute, unwavering reverence. When the giant mother finally emerged from behind the wooden partition, the breath completely vanished from the lungs of the stoic cowboy. The deep crimson fabric draped beautifully over her towering frame. It did not attempt to hide her overwhelming physical strength. Instead, the rich color and elegant cut perfectly accentuated the magnificent, heavy muscles of her broad back and her powerful thighs. She brushed her slightly messy, light brown hair until it fell in soft, flowing waves over her shoulders. For the very first time in a decade, she did not look like a beast of burden. She looked like a majestic, unstoppable mountain queen. Callahan stepped forward, wearing a clean, pressed canvas shirt and his best dark trousers. He offered his large, calloused arm. The profound emotional safety between them hummed in the quiet air. The journey into Oak Creek was remarkably clear, the heavy draft wagon gliding smoothly over the packed snow. When they finally pulled up to the Grand Assembly Hall, the lively sound of a fiddle and an upright piano spilled out into the freezing street. Emmeline felt her massive heart begin to pound violently against her heavy ribs. She gathered little Clara into her arms, took a deep, steadying breath, and stepped through the double wooden doors beside her towering husband. The lively music did not stop, But the conversation in the immediate vicinity died instantly. The townspeople of Oak Creek turned to stare. They fully expected the solitary eccentric rancher to arrive dragging a clumsy, grotesque monster. Instead, they witnessed a magnificent, breathtaking giant of a woman wearing beautiful crimson wool, radiating a quiet, absolute dignity. Beside her stood the stoic, fiercely protective mountain man, presenting a united, impenetrable wall of staggering frontier power. Sitting at a heavy wooden table near the roaring fireplace was the territorial magistrate. Standing directly behind the judge was Silas Thorne, his cruel face twisted into a vicious, confident sneer. Thorne leaned down, whispering poison into the ear of the magistrate, firmly believing the awkward, desperate couple would instantly crumble under the intense public scrutiny. Callahan ignored the hostile stares. He ignored the cruel enforcer completely. He turned his broad shoulders toward Emmeline, gently placing little Clara into the care of the kindly mercantile wife they had helped days before. The stoic cowboy stepped directly in front of his towering wife. He offered his large, warm hand. "Dance with me," he murmured softly, his sharp eyes completely locking onto hers, completely erasing the existence of every other soul in the crowded room. Emmeline hesitated, terrified that her immense strength and chunky leather boots would make her clumsy on the polished wooden floorboards. But she looked into his unwavering gaze and found absolute, profound validation. She placed her massive, calloused hand into his. Callahan gently pulled her into the center of the room. He placed his large hand firmly against the thick, muscular span of her waist. Emmeline rested her heavy hand upon his broad shoulder, completely mindful of his shattered ribs. As the slow, melodic rhythm of a mountain waltz began, they moved together. It was not the clumsy, awkward shuffling of two strangers hiding a desperate lie. It was a beautiful, powerful synchronicity forged by shared hardship, profound respect, and the quiet intimacy of the winter storm. Emmeline relaxed her heavy muscles, allowing the stoic protector to guide her towering frame with steady, deliberate grace. The physical closeness ignited a breathtaking fire deep within her scarred heart. The emotional safety she felt thoroughly blossomed into a powerful, overwhelming, romantic awakening. She looked up at his sun-bronzed face, her resolute eyes shining with heavy, unmistakable tears of pure devotion. Callahan looked down at her, his usual unbreakable stoicism entirely replaced by a profound, radiant tenderness. They did not need to speak a single word. The raw, undeniable truth of their deep love was completely visible to every single person in the grand hall. Across the room, the territorial magistrate slowly lowered his silver spectacles. He looked at Silas Thorne, giving a single dismissive shake of his head. The cruel enforcer turned bright red with furious defeat, realizing he had absolutely no legal power left to destroy them. The marriage was genuine, the validation was absolute. When the final note of the fiddle faded into the warm air, the room remained completely silent for a breathless moment before genuine, respectful applause broke out. Emmeline and Callahan stepped backward, their massive chests heaving slightly from the physical exertion and the intense emotional high. They retrieved little Clara and stepped out through the double wooden doors, seeking the crisp, cooling air of the winter night. They stood upon the raised wooden boardwalk, completely victorious. The terrifying shadows of her past were finally, permanently destroyed. Callahan wrapped his thick arms securely around her broad waist, pulling her heavy frame against his side. Emmeline smiled, looking up toward the distant, jagged peaks where their beautiful, isolated sanctuary awaited them. Her smile instantly vanished. Against the dark, starry canvas of the winter sky, a massive, glowing orange light pulsed violently on the distant horizon. A thick, twisting pillar of black smoke was rising directly from the exact location of their isolated mountain valley. Someone had set the beloved ranch entirely on fire. The heavy wooden wheels of the draft wagon violently slammed against the frozen earth as they tore blindly through the dark mountain pass. The massive horses were driven to their absolute physical limits. Above the jagged mountain peaks, the glowing orange sky pulsed like a terrible bleeding wound against the dark night. The bitter winter wind carried the thick, choking scent of burning pine. The cruel enforcer of the Eastern Company had realized his legal defeat in the warm town hall, but Silas Thorne possessed the cowardly, vindictive heart of a cornered snake. He had ordered his riders to take a final, devastating revenge against the isolated property before fleeing the territory completely. Callahan stood upon the wooden bench of the wagon, his broad shoulders squared against the rushing wind. He held the heavy leather reins with desperate force, completely ignoring the agonizing pain radiating heavily from his shattered ribs. Beside him, Emmeline clutched little Clara securely against her broad chest, her massive heart hammered wildly against her ribs. The beautiful romantic awakening she had just experienced in the grand hall instantly hardened into an absolute unconditional devotion. She looked at the sun-bronzed face of the stoic protector, making a silent, unbreakable vow within her scarred soul. She would absolutely not allow the unforgiving flames to destroy the honorable man who had offered her absolute mercy. They burst into the clearing of the isolated valley. The sight was absolutely horrifying, completely shattering the quiet peace they had fought so hard to build. The main barn, the very sanctuary where the solitary rancher had first lowered his lantern and offered her complete dignity, was a roaring, towering inferno. Bright, violent flames licked eagerly at the dark sky, consuming the thick timber walls. The intense radiating heat melted the deep snow in the yard, turning the frozen earth into a treacherous sea of thick, freezing mud. Over the deafening roar of the fire, the frantic, terrified screams of the trapped horses echoed through the freezing night, tearing at the soul of the mountain man. Callahan brought the heavy wagon to a sudden sliding halt near the edge of the timberline, keeping the wooden vehicle perfectly safe from the flying sparks. He did not speak a single word of complaint regarding his injuries. He dropped the heavy leather reins, grabbed an empty canvas feed sack from the floorboards, and sprinted directly toward the burning structure. Emmeline turned quickly. She tucked the thick woolen blankets tightly around the fragile child in the bed of the wagon, ensuring the girl was completely shielded from the freezing wind and the terrifying sight. "Do not move. Move from this spot, Clara," Emmeline commanded fiercely, her thick voice trembling with raw emotion. "Do not open your eyes until I return for you." The giant mother turned and ran directly after the mountain man, her chunky leather boots pounded heavily through the deep mud, splashing freezing water against her legs. She completely ignored the beautiful crimson wool of her new dress as the delicate hem dragged through the dirty slush. She reached the wide, blazing entrance of the barn just as Callahan vanished completely into the thick, blinding smoke. Emmeline threw her thick, heavily muscular arms over her resolute face and charged directly into the suffocating heat. The interior of the barn was a terrifying vision of pure destruction. The heavy wooden support beams were completely engulfed in bright yellow fire. Flaming debris rained down from the collapsing roof, striking the loose dirt floor with explosive force. Through the blinding, toxic haze, she spotted the towering frame of the stoic cowboy. Callahan was frantically throwing open the heavy iron latches of the wooden stalls, violently waving the canvas sack to drive the panicked horses out through a narrow side door. He was moving much too slowly. The devastating injury to his ribs severely limited his raw physical power. He coughed violently, his heavy frame swaying dangerously as he reached the final stall to save the nervous gray stallion. A deafening, explosive crack of breaking timber echoed directly above them. Emmeline looked up. The primary central crossbeam, a massive, dense trunk of mountain pine fully engulfed in raging fire, snapped entirely in half. It plummeted from the high ceiling, bringing a massive section of the heavy, burning roof directly down towards the injured rancher and the terrified stallion. Callahan looked up, completely trapped by the wooden walls of the stall. He possessed absolutely no time to escape the crushing weight. Emmeline did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She unleashed a guttural, terrifying roar of pure, desperate devotion. The giant woman surged forward, her thick, powerful legs driving her across the dirt floor with unstoppable, devastating momentum. She threw herself directly over the stoic cowboy, placing her towering frame entirely between his injured body and the falling roof. She widened her massive stance, planting her chunky leather boots deeply into the earth. She raised her thick, heavy arms directly above her broad shoulders. The massive, flaming timber slammed into her open hands with the devastating force of a falling boulder. The sheer, staggering impact drove the towering mother violently to one knee. The earth beneath her heavy boots cracked under the immense pressure. The beautiful crimson wool of her dress instantly singed and tore across her broad back. But she did not fall. Emmeline locked the heavy, thick muscles of her immense thighs. She locked her powerful biceps in her massive shoulders. She became an unbreakable pillar of human granite, catching the entire lethal weight of the collapsing roof and holding the flaming sky completely away from the man she loved. "Get the horse out!" Emmeline screamed, her thick voice straining heavily under the immense crushing pressure. The heavy muscles of her towering physique bulged and trembled violently as she fought the relentless gravity. Callahan stared at her in absolute profound horror. The flames licked dangerously close to her resolute face. She was holding a weight that would have instantly pulverized an ordinary frontierman, utilizing the exact immense strength she had once deeply hated to secure his survival. "I will not leave you to burn!" The deep, rumbling voice of the rancher tore through the heavy smoke, absolute panic finally breaking his stoic facade. He reached his large hands out, desperately trying to help her hold the massive timber. "Your ribs will shatter completely!" Emmeline gasped, the intense heat searing her calloused palms. "Eek, the stallion, and go. I cannot hold the roof if the heavy horse panics and strikes me." The terrified stallion reared violently behind them, its heavy hooves thrashing wildly, threatening to trample them both if it did not immediately escape the flames. Callahan gritted his teeth, absolute agony tearing at his noble soul. He grabbed the heavy leather halter of the gray horse, forcefully dragging the panicked beast out through the side door and directly into the freezing snow. Emmeline remained completely alone in the center of the blazing inferno. The fire roared with deafening, merciless fury, rapidly eating away at the remaining support pillars of the structure. The massive timber resting upon her broad shoulders grew infinitely heavier by the second. Her thick, powerful arms began to shake uncontrollably. The suffocating black smoke completely filled her burning lungs, blinding her sharp, resolute eyes. She had saved his life. She had saved his livelihood. But as the surrounding walls of the barn began to cave inward, unleashing a catastrophic, terrifying wave of fire and heavy debris directly toward her towering frame, a devastating question remained. Would the giant, wildly muscular mother possess enough remaining physical strength to escape the collapsing structure? Or had she just made the ultimate fatal sacrifice for the only family she had ever truly known?